14 years of Sunday nights. That's how long 40 million Americans sat down together and watched the Cartwright family ride across the Ponderosa, that familiar theme music filling every living room like something between a hymn and a heartbeat. Ben, Adam, Hoss, and little Joe looked like the perfect American family, loyal, unbreakable, and written in granite. They were hiding everything. What the audience never got to see was the real story running underneath that television western. The contracts that trapped men who resented them, the death that broke the cast in ways they never recovered from, and a patriarch played by a man whose past was stranger and darker than any episode the writers ever produced. And before we get into all of it, there is something specific you need to know about Pernell Roberts, the man who played Adam Cartwright. He walked away from one of the highest-rated shows in NBC history at the absolute peak of its run. And what he said about why he did it was buried so fast that most fans never heard a single word. First, though, let's talk about what this show actually was. When Bonanza premiered in September of 1959, westerns were already everywhere on American television, cheap, interchangeable, and largely forgettable. Bonanza refused to be any of those things. NBC filmed it in color when most households still owned black and white sets, a gamble that looked reckless at the time and prescient in hindsight. And the show's architects built it around something no Western had seriously tried before: a family. Not a lone gunfighter, not a marshal with a badge, but a father and 3 sons, each born to a different mother, each carrying a different piece of who Ben Cartwright was. That emotional scaffolding is what made the show land differently from everything else on the dial. By the middle of the 1960s, Bonanza had climbed to the #1 position on American television, not just among Westerns, but across every genre on every network. 40 million viewers tuned in on Sunday nights, roughly 1 in 5 Americans watching the same program at the same time. And for the men who had come home from World War II and were now raising families in the suburbs, Ben Cartwright was either the father they remembered or the one they had always wished they had. The man who played him carried a past that made that casting almost eerie in hindsight. Lorne Greene was born in Ottawa, Canada, in 1915, and long before he ever set foot on the Ponderosa, radio broadcasting had already turned him into something close to a national figure. During the early years of World War II, Greene served as the chief newsreader for the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and his voice became one of the most recognized and most dreaded sounds in Canadian homes. Night after night, he delivered the war dispatches, the casualty lists, the dark news from overseas that families gathered around their sets too afraid to miss. And his voice carried such unrelenting gravity that Canadians gave him a name that stayed with him for the rest of his life: the voice of doom. None of that was performance. When Greene walked onto a television set in 1959 and became Ben Cartwright, the steadiness he projected had been built in real darkness, reading real names of real dead men into a microphone. And here is something that almost nobody remembers today. Right in the middle of Bonanza's dominant run, in 1964, Greene recorded a song called Ringo, a spoken-word country music ballad about a gunfighter, and it climbed straight to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. Ben Cartwright knocked the Beatles off the top of the American charts during the height of Beatlemania, which is one of those facts that sounds invented and absolutely is not. Greene released multiple albums throughout the decade, maintained an active recording career the whole time, and the studio stayed largely quiet about all of it because none of it fit the image of the stoic, unsmiling patriarch that 40 million viewers had already decided he was. The man contained more than the Ponderosa had room for. Now, Pernell Roberts. This is where the curtain starts to move. By nearly every account from people who worked alongside him, Roberts was one of the most gifted actors on that set, classically trained, intellectually restless, and convinced from the beginning that his work should carry weight. What wore him down was not the schedule or the hours. The scripts felt hollow to him, deliberately held at a safe distance from anything that might make a sponsor nervous or an audience genuinely unsettled. Roberts pushed for Adam Cartwright to be written as a complicated man with complicated motives, and the producers pushed back hard for a version of Adam who was handsome and dependable, and nothing more than that. Roberts also brought documented public objections to how black performers were being cast, and far more often not cast, on the show. And he said so in interviews at a time when very few actors in his position were willing to say anything at all. The blowback from NBC was swift. After 6 seasons of watching Bonanza become a cultural institution while feeling more and more like a prop in someone else's production, he walked off the Ponderosa without looking back. The studio described the parting as amicable. Roberts, in later interviews, described it differently. The show sent Adam away with a single line of dialogue and kept going. But the family on screen never felt entirely whole again. Then came May 13th, 1972, and nothing that followed was the same. Dan Blocker, Hoss Cartwright, the warm giant at the center of every scene he ever appeared in, died that day from a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot that followed what was supposed to be routine gallbladder surgery. 43 years old, gone before anyone had time to prepare. And the cast had no framework for it because nobody had written a version of this show where Hoss was simply absent. Greene absorbed the news with the outward composure of a man who had spent years reading death into a microphone. But people close to the production said the loss cut him in ways he was not built to show publicly. Michael Landon, who had known Blocker for more than a decade, came apart. What everyone who was there consistently described afterward was a man who had held the emotional temperature of that set steady through everything. The long days, the accumulated friction of 14 years, the pressures that never fully made it into any interview, and whose absence made that invisible work suddenly and brutally visible. The producers brought in a new character, a young ranch hand named Griff, hoping to keep the show running. The audience did not accept it, not because anyone told them not to, but because the family was broken, and they could feel it through the screen. NBC canceled Bonanza in January of 1973, 14 seasons after it began. The ratings had declined, yes, but the real answer was sitting plainly in those numbers. Without Blocker, without Hoss, the Cartwright family stopped feeling believable. And without the family, the show had nothing left to stand on. While Bonanza dominated American television throughout the 1960s and into the early 1970s, Landon's life away from the cameras was considerably messier than Little Joe ever let on. Landon struggled with alcohol during portions of the Bonanza years, something he acknowledged himself in later interviews with the directness that became a defining trait of his public life after the show ended. 2 marriages collapsed during that period, and the pressure of being the youngest and most recognizable face on the most watched program in the country was a weight he did not always carry cleanly. Working out who he actually was happened in full view of an audience that had already made up its mind about him. What that audience also never saw was the machinery producing what they loved. The contracts binding those actors to NBC under terms some found suffocating. The storylines that writers proposed and executives quietly killed because the subject matter, race, war, the actual texture of justice in the American West made sponsors uneasy and networks cautious. The Bonanza that aired every Sunday night was a negotiated, commercially managed version of a show that might have been something braver. The rooms where those decisions got made stayed closed, and most of what happened in them stayed there. None of that erases what the show gave to the people who loved it, and it would be dishonest to end anywhere near a cynical note. Greene was, by every account from people who knew him on set, a man of real decency in that workplace. Blocker really was the heart of that cast in ways that only became clear after he was gone. The bond those men built over 14 years of working together was real, even when everything surrounding it was complicated and sometimes painful. What Bonanza meant to you, that part, was never manufactured. So leave me your answer in the comments. Of all 4 Cartwrights, Ben, Adam, Hoss, or Little Joe? Which one did you love most? And what was it about him that stayed with you all these years?